Say the Semantics, episode 316. It is May 16th, 2025. My name is Myro. This is the podcast where I ramble on for a bit about some shit. Recording this on a Friday afternoon / evening. We got a nice and lovely day out here. My neck has been just messing me up for like the last couple of days or so. I feel like I didn't like sleep right one night, and that's just kind of been affecting me. So I've been out of commission for a little bit. I was trying to I wanted to exercise, or I actually even wanted to go on a walk yesterday, but I just did not. I felt like if I even moved my neck slightly, it would have hurt. So yeah, I wasn't really able to do much yesterday, and I was thinking of maybe trying to work out or something, but I'm gonna ease back into it, because I don't want to risk anything. It's so funny how like I'm so like risk averse when it comes to these little things. You know what I mean? It's just like even when it's super minor. But listen, man. I mean, this is just like a fact of getting older, really. That's just kind of what it is, I think. Where I'm talking like I'm in my middle aged or something. No, it's just like I think I've definitely noticed that these little things come up a lot more frequently now than before. So I'm just trying to be a little more wary of that and take care of my body as best as I can. But yeah, that's kind of where my headspace is at. I wanted to talk about the Warriors getting eliminated from the playoffs, which was kind of seemed kind of like an inevitability, and also catch up a little bit on some playoff stuff. Yeah, let's get to the Warriors first, because I do want to spend a little bit of time going over this season, because it was quite a roller coaster in terms of just the ups and downs, and the eventual highs that we got to, but kind of everything that sort of preceded it was something to worth noting too. So I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a summary or a bit of a eulogy, if you want to call it that, on this season, and then talk about what we have to sort of look forward to going into next season, right? I think there are things that we can feel pretty good about for the most part. We saw what the makeup of this group looked like with Steph and Jimmy at the helm. We saw the success that they had, and the success and the lack of success that resulted when Steph went down in the Minnesota series, right? So I think that should give us a lot of confidence going into next season. At least kind of that being, I've kept saying that this season, is kind of the last push, based on what we've seen with Steph, barring any other significant injury, and, hoping that he'll get a nice recovery over the summer, is that he can still play at an elite level. We saw what he was able to do against Houston, a team that played him incredibly physical, and I think he was able to work around that. Of course, there were definitely moments where that style of play became incredibly taxing, which kind of led to them, coming back to tying the series and taking it to Game 7. But prior to that, we really saw Steph kind of perform fairly well, right? Not to the level of extraordinaire that he's had in the past, of course, right? But still to a pretty high level. And I think that I believe that he can still carry some of that over into next season as well, right? I think that with next, I said this earlier this season, but I think it's bear repeating. I think I'm going to just keep repeating it until it's not the case, but I do think next season, and then also considering the Jimmy contract, I think will be kind of the push, really. That's going to be sort of like this last stand kind of thing. Not quite like a last dance, it's different. But I think that's going to be the best and probably one of the last chances to really do something, to really get a run going. I think that if we can try to get and upgrade some of our pieces, which sounds pretty, this sounds pretty reminiscent of what we've been talking about over the course of the last few seasons. But hopefully, I really hope that, Mike Dunleavy and, others can see that this team is just too damn small. This has just been an issue that has consistently plagued this team over the course of the last 3 seasons or so after their championship. We managed to make it work this year for the first round because just I think the level of experience and all of these things, those did lead us over the edge in the series with the Rockets. But I think that if we were to put ourselves in a position to really be contenders, I think there has to be more pieces that can complement. Our front line was in a lineup with Steph was Jimmy and Draymond at the 4, which is tiny. You know what I mean? Like, of course, you appreciate what Draymond is able to do, and he held up his own in a great way against the Rockets. But I do think that we saw the limitations of that going into the Minnesota series, obviously just without Steph and everything. And the centers that we do have at our disposal just do not have the strength and the size to be able to withstand certain, other centers of way higher caliber of a Rudy Gobert, and even beyond that, right? Like, even if we somehow got past Minnesota, like, we would have either played Denver or OKC, and I just don't know how well our front lineup could have played against those 2 teams. I just couldn't really see a scenario in which we would have really lasted against those other teams, right? And so that is just going to be I know it's easier said than done to just be like, hey, let's plop like a competent center to, kind of slot alongside Steph and the rest of crew to fit into the schemes a lot better. But it's just kind of pertinent to really get some other size, you know what I mean? Like, the 3-guard lineup, it worked in some cases, but I still dislike it quite a bit. Pods is able to do his best, and he's able to hold on his own against some larger players because he just has sort of the aptitude to do that, and he has the confidence, and he has the, he's just able to kind of really push through and guard against players that have, 6-7 inches on him. But you just saw the limitations of that, and I think that there's got to be something that has to be really addressed, and I really hope that they're able to kind of make some moves and get some, some more wing. Obviously every team is looking for some wing size, but wing size and center depth and just larger bodies, right? I think will be good. I think with someone, we're looking at just the remaining pieces that do surround, just Steph and Jimmy and Draymond. Once Steph went out, it was very clear that the system really only worked because of kind of the nature of how the offense was so, heavily centered around Steph and his gravity. Whether it's, him, allowing there to be some like off ball cuts or whatever, like him taking away attention for other players to do things, that pulls defenders away from teammates, that allows them to get open and all that stuff. It just wasn't the same with nobody else could shoot for shit. You know what I mean? And I would like to, I think, Buddy had an awesome playoffs. I think Game 7 is going to be nice memory to kind of put up there. Of course it's different because it didn't lead to, it didn't lead to like an extended run for this team, but I think we can all appreciate that being a part of, the Warriors' history, even if it is kind of maybe a footnote of sorts. So, and I think he performed really well. He really stepped up to the challenge, and I think that if, the hope is that he can kind of carry that forward, and it sounds like he has kind of carved himself a spot here with his roster and kind of finally found some form of a home for him, at least kind of going into later in his career. But I do hope that he can continue to sort of keep that up, because I do think that he had a huge impact in the Rockets series, and he had some moments in Game 1 at least. I thought he played really well. I think with some of the other pieces, kind of the remnants of the 22 championship with Kevon Looney, Gary Payton, Kuminga, Moses Moody. I think with all of those, especially Kuminga, because that's kind of like the key piece that a lot of people are talking about. With him, he really sort of showed that he has the ability to perform when he's given kind of the reins to do so, outside of kind of the Steph heliocentric offense, that he just works well if he's kind of just given the green light, and that he is sort of put in, depending on whatever offensive sets that they're running, or, whatever sort of the intention is, if he's directed to take initiative, he's able to do things. We saw him get past like Naz Reid and Ant, and he really, like, he looked like probably one of the more, like, probably the most athletic dude out there in this Minnesota series. I thought he looked really impressive in terms of just his ability to get up shots and play through contact and all those kinds of things. I just don't like it. It's been 4 years, right, with him. And, if he's able to perform like this, it kind of has to be in a different type of system and not with the Warriors. You know what I mean? And it would be good for him to be put in a position where he can kind of put up numbers and, look good doing it. I just think in this, it just hasn't worked out. It just hasn't worked out. I wish the best for him. I just don't think it's, this what, the whole Steve Kerr thing and the fact that he wasn't playing Kuminga. I don't exactly remember what I said. I think I was maybe, especially last season, I was definitely harsh on Steve and his rotations. Just the fact that he wasn't playing players like Moody and stuff like that. And, while they were sort of, I guess, empowered to pick up more responsibility, especially Moody when he started in the, like in the Rockets series and stuff. We saw that he was able to do certain things, and especially towards the end of the season, like he looked good, but he's just not reliable enough to lean to, right? And it's just not someone that you necessarily want to have in your rotation if they're going to be this inconsistent, right? Especially when you don't know what you're going to get from night to night. I mean, in the Minnesota series, he just completely faded away. Like, he dropped out of the rotation almost. He had some moments, like in I think it was game 4, when they were sort of coming back. Like, he was sort of leading the charge there a little bit, but even then it was just, again, it was like kind of like a little too late, too little too late sort of thing. So just kind of with the younger players from the draft class, which is really unfortunate. It's just like a kind of a, the fact that the team just has not, outside of players like maybe Pods, and then Quentin Post has been a nice surprise, but he was the second rounder, so there was no, like, I think when he started to get minutes later on in the series, I think it was just the fact that we needed like a center of sorts, and I think it really worked out well with him. But we have seen the limitations. Like, I think we're asking quite a lot from a second round player to perform at the level in the playoffs. You know what I mean? I don't know if someone like him would have necessarily even been in the rotation on other playoff teams. You know what I mean? Because of some of his defensive limitations. But just kind of going back, the drafting has been pretty questionable, I think, by the front office, especially kind of going back to the James Wiseman pick. Look, I totally get it. Like, that kind of is in line with what we want as like a center who can be mobile, who can fit into kind of the flow, the motion offense with the Warriors. That was kind of the hope. It just didn't really turn out well, but on top of that, like, the other picks haven't necessarily resulted in a ton of success either. Like, sure, of course, Pods has been great, and he's produced really well for us. But he goes through his stretches too, right? He can have moments where he's like, game 5, he put up like 25 or something like that, right? He had big numbers, but throughout that series, he was pretty on and off as well. So it's if we're looking for players that can really contribute and really fit into this system and really kind of be someone who can kind of contribute immediately and provide some level of stability, it's asking for a lot. But I don't think at this point you'll find someone, or you could have really found someone in the draft that would have fit those needs. So you're going to have to kind of look elsewhere, right? I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a huge offseason, right? Considering the potential moves that are going to be made with Giannis, potentially, and, maybe some other players that might not be, that might not have come to light yet. But hopefully the Warriors can kind of get into that mix and really try to gain someone from that, because the West is going to be a shit show. It's going to be a nightmare once again. And yeah, I don't know. There's no time like the present, and I think they should really try to seize that, and which they did this year. And I'm really happy with the direction they took. Despite my reservations about the Jimmy trade, I'm more than happy that it's worked out and that we were put into a position of just going to the playoffs, right? I mean, this was kind of the result that I really wanted, you know what I mean? Because I do believe that there was going to be a bit of a ceiling with this team. I didn't think they were going to win the championship this year. I felt pretty confident about that. But if we were even just able to compete in some way, shape, or form, I would have been really happy about that. And just considering the turnaround that we've had this season from, where it was earlier, and just sort of the lulls and the downs of, blowing the leads and, being a below 500 team and all of these things, the fact that we've reached this point, I think, is worth celebrating and worth making note of, because I do think it's It's easy to get caught up in just sort of we lost, and I'm just feeling kind of it's like, come on, let's be a little bit more. I think as a franchise and as a fan base, it's very spoiled, right? So it's like, if anything falls short of the ultimate goal, it feels like a failure. But look, this is kind of where my expectations were, and I'm very happy with how things sort of ended up, despite the disappointment with Steph going down, right? So overall, I think this season has been a great success, and it's been good. It's been a good, it was hard. The first half of the season was tough, but to kind of sit through that and to get to where we eventually did, I think it was worth being patient over. It was worth worth kind of just sort of sitting in disappointment when things didn't turn out the way that you wanted to. But the eventual kind of result and ending, I felt pretty good about, and I'm looking forward to next season. Right, I do think, of course, there's going to be question marks, and there's always going to be question marks, but just the way seeing Steph play, Jimmy being able to kind of complement that. I think if this is kind of like, if this current core three are really sort of in this twilight of their career, and if they really want to put themselves in playoff and championship contention again, this upcoming year, just and just sort of in tandem with like Jimmy's 2-year contract, is the push. It's the push. That's really that's going to be it, I think, right? I said that last year. I said that earlier this season, but I do believe that. I do think that, just like, I just don't, it's really hard for me to see someone like even like Draymond performing at the level he did, and defensively, you know what I mean? Like, we saw some of the there were some missteps as the playoffs progressed, right? Especially during Minnesota. Like, he just could not, depend, just because of like the physicality that he faced in, the Houston series. I do think that kind of affected him. Like, he was definitely, he was highly leveraged just to be the defensive back line. And that's a lot. He was going up against 7-footers. He's good at that. He's been great at that his entire career. But this time around, I think that it's just like, it's hard, you know what I mean? It's hard to try to keep that up for, over the course of a 7-game series, and then going into the second round and beyond. So, I think that next year is going to be kind of the last sort of hurrah of sorts, and then we'll see what the future holds for Steph and for this franchise. You know what I mean? I'm fully ready. Like, I'm like, part of me is sort of anticipating what that is going to look like. The team without Steph, and just I think some of my friends are kind of have admitted that that they'll probably check out once Steph retires and moves on from the team, which I totally get, right? I think that it will be interesting to see what the next generation of the Warriors team is going to look like. We still have plenty of time. Steph is still able to produce at an incredible level at his age. But I am kind of envisioning what it's going to look like, right? And whether, how much we can put into, how much faith we can put into kind of the front office in making decisions and being able to get talent. Because that has been kind of an issue, you know what I mean? But like, if we're sort of like in a tanking position, it's a whole different conversation. Because that's sort of assuming that we can kind of get, a higher draft pick and rebuild from that process. But that's a whole conversation down the line. which we'll get into when that time comes. But yeah, look, despite everything, despite the ending, I'm happy and satisfied with the season. I'm really glad that this Jimmy trade worked out for the most part, and that he really kind of fits so seamlessly, at least for like the last 20-ish games or so. 30 plus if you count the playoffs. How seamlessly he kind of fit alongside Steph and Draymond and kind of that system. And it was awesome to see. There's a lot of highlights to kind of pick out too. I think the first game where he played in Chicago, I was just like, dude, fuck, man, this is not looking good. Where they went down by like 25 or something crazy like that. And then they came back and won by 20 plus. So it was like a 40-point turnaround, and they sort of pulled it off. And that was like, okay, alrighty, I guess this is it. This is the Steph and Jimmy team now, and we'll see how kind of things go. And it worked out really well until it unfortunately came to just sort of a disappointing, just you just can't do much about injuries, right? Like that's just sort of the unfortunate nature of the sport. Sometimes injuries happen. You just have to sort of deal with it. But yeah, good season. Let's talk a little bit of the remainder of the playoffs. So Timberwolves move on, and they are going to wait on the Nuggets and the Thunder. Nuggets won Game 6 yesterday back in Denver. I have no idea who's going to win this series. Like I of course, just overall, I've predicted that the Thunder are going to win the championship, but just based on the experience and sort of the level of poise that the Nuggets have shown. Look, man, that experience is huge when it comes to these kinds of series. The Nuggets have just been in a bunch of 7-game series over the course of, Jokic's tenure, and they got Jokic, right? Like that's just kind of what it is. I do think the Thunder, I said I don't know who, but I do think, at home, the Thunder are going to be able to pull it off. I think J-Dub or Jalen Williams, he did not have a good game yesterday, but I do think he'll have a bounce back. I think there's a lot of scrutiny thrown his way because there is a lot of pressure on him to perform as the second best or just secondary offensive threat alongside Shea. And during this series, he just has not, except for one of the games where he scored like 30 plus or so. He has not really shown that he can consistently be that guy. And, there's all of these pundits and stuff that talk about it. But I think he'll pull through. I think he'll be good. I don't know if he's good enough to be that guy. I don't know if he's good enough to be like the number 2 player. I do think that kind of that leans towards Chet a little bit more, and I think his ceiling is a lot higher, just considering the type of player he is, and just the way he's able to both score and stretch the floor, and then also be a threat on the defensive end. I think he's quite he's going to be quite the player. But I do think that Jalen Williams he'll be all right. I think it's just going to be, it's just tougher because of just the stakes and everything. But I do think, the home crowd and everything, I think role players will probably step up in Game 7, and Shea's going to just be good. Jokic is going to be, he's going to do the most he can. And I do think it's going to be a close game. So that's going to be on Sunday. I'm really excited for that. I hope that I'll be able to catch a good chunk of it. If not live, then I hope to be able to rewatch rewatch parts of that game. But yeah, it's 2 7-game series for the Nuggets is crazy. You know what I mean? Just like the gauntlet they've had to go through, and the fact that they've pulled through for the most part is pretty impressive, right? I do think the Thunder are gonna win, and if they don't, you got 2 number 1 seeds, 2 60-win teams that have gotten eliminated in the playoffs, which would be crazy, absolutely crazy, right? I don't know. Has that happened before? Probably, right? But I'm sure, statistically, it's like this is the first time in 30 years, whatever. If that does happen, then we can kind of start a conversation about, I don't know. Because then you have, like, outside, the Knicks are playing the Celtics right now. I haven't looked up the score. This is the statistic that I have been quoting for a good while now, where there has not been a team seeded, I think, 4 or below that has won the championship in like 30 years or something like that. Depending on how things shake up, depending on, because we have, I guess the Knicks are a 3rd seed. Pacers are a 4th seed. If the Nuggets win, you got a 4th seed, and then the Wolves are a 6th seed. So, of course, there's still the chance that like the Knicks will pull through or whatever, or the Celtics pull through somehow, and win tonight, and then win Game 7. Then the whole stat of 3 seed or above winning the championship will continue to hold true, but it could get broken this year. And there's a higher chance of that getting broken this year, because right now at least half of the teams are lower than a 3 seed, right? Because you got the Pacers and the Wolves. So if either of those teams, if both of those teams somehow made it to the finals, then the freaking, then that whole stat is finally going to be broken. And I think that's going to be a huge occasion. I don't know if that's going to happen, because I still have OKC winning the whole thing. But if we do reach that point where one of those teams, or I mean even the Nuggets too, who are a 4 seed, somehow make it and win the whole thing, I think that will kind of, I think it's going to be a huge discussion point where this is going to be sort of the age of well, we're already in an age of parity, considering, the fact that there hasn't been repeat champions since, 2017 and 18. There's been a new champion every single year from that point on. Listen, it's gonna be something, you know what I mean? So if the Nuggets pull through, then there's gonna be an even higher chance of that happening, of the 3rd seed, 4th seed or below seeded team winning the championship. So, you never know. Listen, I mean, if that is the case, if the Nuggets do win, then I'm going to hold steady, and I'm going to say that New York wins the championship. Well, they still need to win against Boston first, but if that is the case, New York, as the remaining three seed, is going to win the championship. So that is kind of my theory, or whatever. You know what I mean. Anyways, yeah, we got some. We're nearing, the conference finals, which start next week, and I'm more than excited to get into that even further. It has been an awesome playoffs, despite some, of course, my Warriors losing and that kind of thing. But overall, it's been great. It's been fantastic, and I think if things sort of shake, like regardless of, I do think like the Knicks will probably pull through. Knicks Pacers is going to be an awesome series. I'll talk about that, once that sort of is finalized. Who knows? I mean, the Boston, you never know. Boston, they might come through even without Jason Tatum. But that will be a pretty fun series. And then whoever the Wolves get in the Western Conference Finals, I think that would be, if it's a Denver Minnesota matchup, I think that would be a lot more of a quote unquote exciting, matchup because of last year's playoffs and everything. But I do think like an OKC Wolves series would be pretty interesting as well. Although I do feel like the Thunder would have a pretty. I would favor the Thunder a lot more over the Wolves in that case. But it still could be a fun series. So we got a lot of good stuff coming up, and I'm excited to delve into that. And once things kind of get finalized going into like Sunday and stuff, I will talk about that. 12:30 game on Sunday for Game 7, which is kind of crazy. It's a little early, you know what I mean? Can we do a late night for that? So I don't have to so I have something to look forward to at the end of the day. It's fine. Yeah, less basketball too. I don't know, what am I going to do with that time? I'll have to figure that out. Anyways, I'll talk about, depending on, I guess, we got the Knicks and Celtics game going on right now. Maybe I'll talk about that tomorrow. And maybe I don't know. We'll see. Maybe I'll talk about some other stuff, tomorrow or Sunday, depending on the results of these games, and then do a whole, conference finals preview and that kind of thing. So that'll be next. All right, bit of an extended recording today. So I decided, recording this pretty much right after the Knicks and Celtics game. So the Knicks pulled it off, and they just completely decimated the Celtics in this game. Really just kind of taking control and putting them away, just leaving no doubt of them moving on to the Eastern Conference Finals. I wanted to kind of do this because I think it's a pretty wild occasion right now. I've already been kind of talking about this over the course of these playoffs, but this will be the 7th time in a row that we will have a new champion, no consecutive champion. The Nuggets, that's sort of still up in the air, obviously. But for them, even if the Nuggets won this year, it would not be consecutive championships, right? But there is a high possibility that there will be a new NBA champion, for the 7th time in a row. And I think that's a pretty momentous thing. You know what I mean? I do want to talk a little bit about the Knicks and kind of their journey that they've been on. What a wild kind of season it's been for them. I think the Cat trade, when it happened during the summer, I kind of looked at it as a bit of I looked at it as more of a mistake I kind of looked, my initial reaction to it was that it was kind of it was like, damn, this feels like a very knee-jerk reaction by Minnesota to pull this one off simply due to salary and all that stuff. We can see now, and I'll talk about that too, the fact that it's technically benefited both of the franchises to where both of them are in the conference finals now. But I think upon reflection, I was kind of in the camp that this was actually a decent move for Minnesota. I thought this was like a kind of an even-ish trade. I think if I go back and listen, I believe I said something like that. I don't know. It's been a year since I talked about it. So maybe I'll have to revisit my thoughts and go back to that episode. I'm going to have to scroll through quite a lot. But when the cat trade did happen, and then kind of after, just like upon reflection, I think I said that it was sort of like an even trade in some instances. Um, I think that New York was giving up quite a bit of depth, I felt, in trading Randall and DiVincenzo. Um, but I was like, actually, this sort of makes a team like Minnesota a lot deeper because they have, they presumably had, at that time, it's like presumably DiVincenzo would be coming off the bench, which he has. And, I think the Randall piece was definitely a question mark for sure. But I felt that just on a, roster to roster basis, I thought Minnesota had kind of the edge in this trade. And New York gave quite a bit up to get him, right? Again, I have to go back and listen to it because I don't remember my exact thoughts, right? But starting from that point in the New York perspective, I think this will be kind of a fun exercise, looking at the trajectories of both New York and Minnesota, because you could argue they've both had similar question marks about whether their roster was even capable of doing anything in the playoffs. There was a lot of questions about the fit of both of the big trade pieces throughout the regular season. In New York's case, it was the fact that the defensive rating for their team with Cat on the floor was pretty poor, and on the Minnesota side of things, the Randall fit just was like oil and water. You know what I mean? It just did not mix or mesh very well. Considering Randall's play style is a fairly, notably being a heavy ISO scorer, right? And how that it doesn't really fit well into the functions of the Minnesota offense. The fact that it could potentially take the ball out of Anthony Edwards' hands, there were a lot of those kinds of things, right? And it didn't really work out very well in the beginning of the season, right? I kind of saw a lot of the same blemishes and mistakes that the Timberwolves have been making over the course of however long Ant's sort of been a part of that. Since Ant's been kind of the forefront and focus of the franchise. Just like these mistakes and the fact that Randall just was not playing well within the ecosystem of the Timberwolves. And then things shifted. Like, I think this was something that's been kind of reported about Randall coming back from his injury about like halfway through the season or so. And ever since then, they've just been a really good team. They've been on a tear leading into the playoffs. I still had a lot of qualms about their late game execution. That was like the one thing that I kind of was like, hinging on, the fact that they struggled to close out games. There were a couple, the games that I always sort of come to mind that I cite for them is when they blew a lead to Milwaukee and when they blew a lead to Indiana. So those kind of two cases really kind of come to mind. And that was just like a huge, like, listen, I don't think this year is it for them. I just don't see this working out for them in the clutch, especially when you're going up against some, just high IQ players. And that was kind of why I had my reservations about them going up against the Lakers. Like, sure, like on paper, actually on paper, the Wolves do look like the better team in depth and just quality of players and everything like that. But I was kind of in the boat with a lot of other people, seeing that they just like having players like Luka and LeBron, two players who are just incredibly well polished at the end of games. Like, you would trust either of them to have the ball in their hands in the clutch. And I thought that was going to be kind of like, if the Lakers could keep it close enough and down the stretch, I thought that the Lakers could like out execute them. And that was not the case. That was not the case at all. It turns out the depth actually helped out the Wolves, and you had just major contributions from, Julius Randle and company, right? And he really sort of shown out. He's continued to have like a really great playoff series against my Warriors as well. Like, so it's been just like a really impressive fit, right, for the Minnesota side of things, and how well that sort of worked out for them. And they're back in the Western Conference Finals again. I think in either series, whether it's the Nuggets or the Thunder, you would probably favor, those either, the two higher seeded opponents. I think the Wolves would rather play Denver as opposed to OKC. Just due to like familiarity and all those things. I think the Thunder have so many players that they could throw at like Ant, and I think that could really affect the series, and the Timberwolves' chances. So we'll see how that goes, but that's kind of, I'm jumping back and forth, but I guess I went to the Minnesota side of things first. That's kind of how it's sort of been the trajectory for the Timberwolves this year, which has been really impressive. Like, obviously I'm still a little butthurt about them knocking out the Warriors and everything, and just the fact, Steph, whatever, all those things that I've, just talked about earlier today. But I do think it's worth noting just like the fact that this huge trade that I think, the Minnesota was probably the more heavily scrutinized team in this trade, absolutely. But it worked out for them. But even New York, with just kind of the hiccups, the fact, and this was like a huge discussion point, especially kind of as the season progressed for New York, the fact that they could not beat some of the top teams in the league. They were like 0-10 or something like that against Boston, Cleveland, and OKC. And that was like a huge, like thorn on the side of the Knicks. Then I think a lot of people, including myself, had a lot of skepticism about them being able to kind of overcome that. I think throughout the season, the Knicks with Cat, just there were issues in ways of, having him be kind of the center and be the defensive anchor, quote unquote defensive anchor of the team, the back line. Clearly there were just tons of issues with that because just of his ability, and he's just flawed as a defender. Like, he's always been, that's just what he's been known for, right? But I do think that it has, especially with the reinsertion of Mitchell Robinson back into the roster, I think has been a huge boost for this team. Now, for the fact that they can have a all, mostly defensively minded lineup if they need to in situations, right? They can do the too big thing with Mitchell at the 5 and, Mitchell Robinson at the 5 and Cat at the 4, kind of in a similar way that the Timberwolves did with the Cat and Gobert tandem. So, like, I do think that the criticisms and the concerns were absolutely warranted, right? But they were still a 50-plus win team. They were still one of the better they were the 3rd seed in the East, right? Sure, they weren't up, in terms of regular season standards, they weren't up to par with the Celtics or the Cavs, but I think they really found a way to really dig in and show kind of that grit that we had seen previously in other, other iterations of this team, right? Last year when they, you know, when they played against the Sixers, they lost against the Pacers, but they were just a completely hobbled, roster, especially at the end of the second round and game seven, right? Brunson going out like in the second half and other players just not being present. But you kind of saw the toughness and the grit. That was kind of like a huge characteristic that I think a lot of Knicks fans latched onto. And then the year previous to that, where they also went to the second round when they beat the Cavs, right? That was like it wasn't like a huge upset, but it was like kind of like a minor upset, 4-5 matchup, where they beat the Cavs in 5, and that was really kind of just like Mitchell Robinson, I think, was kind of like the highlight of that series in terms of the way he played against Jared Allen. And I think Mobley was part of that too, right? I'm not quite sure. Or did they draft him? I think he was part of that. So it was just like, I think there were questions, especially for this year, about the fact that they maybe lost a part of that identity from those prior, these previous kind of seasons. Maybe they just didn't have the personnel. They didn't have, someone like DiVincenzo who brought a lot of that grit in last year's playoffs. Isaiah Hartenstein was a huge part of their roster and of their identity and those kinds of things. You could argue Randall was, he was injured, during the playoffs. But you could argue that his presence, as kind of during the regular season and stuff, contributed to how their identity was sort of perceived, right? So when you lose those types of players, I think it's fair to sort of maybe assume that part of that identity is lost in some way, shape, or form. And I think what we've seen throughout these playoffs, whether it's in the first round or in this, or more, most especially in this series against the Celtics, is that they actually do have that still. They still have a part of that. I think just in part to, having a leader like Brunson who sort of, plays in kind of that play style. You have Josh Hart, who is just kind of like the ultimate hustle player. And then you have Mitchell Robinson kind of brought back into the mix, who's a huge part of what worked out for them last year and the year before, right? So I do think that it was, maybe they lost some of the pieces that made and kind of integrated with this culture with Thibodeau and everything like that. But they were able to kind of retain some of that still. And, even players like Cat was kind of able to exhibit that by like going hard into the paint and, just going up strong. And, he's shown some toughness during this series. Of course, there's going to be lapses in judgment and defensive rotations and all that stuff. Like that just sort of comes with his, him as a player. But I think altogether, they really brought it. And I think, they sort of, like, regardless of the Tatum injury, they won the series, like, handedly. I think they won this series. Like, sure, game 5 was kind of a blowout in response to the Tatum injury and all that stuff. And you could maybe take something away from that. But consistently when it mattered, the Knicks showed up, and they showed that they can really play against some of the tougher opponents, right? Against the, last year's champs. So I think it's super impressive. I like looking at the two examples of the Knicks and the Wolves. I think it would be probably the most interesting storyline if they somehow made it to the finals, right? Obviously, we're not there yet, but we're at this point, so I think it's worth, just talking about and noting just the trajectory of these two teams, who I have been very just like, interested in and kind of engaged with throughout the regular season, because I've been wanting to kind of see what it looks like with the integration of the new players on their team, for both of their respective teams. And it's just such a fascinating, storyline. And I think in terms of that, in terms of narrative on all that stuff, if you want to get something, I think that those two matchups in the finals would kind of like, it would sort of be like I don't want to say fairy tale, but it would make for an incredibly compelling through line for this season, right? Because that trade during the off season, right before training camp, that was really what kicked off this season, right? And that was kind of the pinpoint, the sort of like the moment where just like the season was just kind of started in a way, right? Even without the basketball. And so I think if it somehow ends up with these two teams in the finals, I think it would just be such a great story. You know what I mean? Obviously we'll see how things end up. There are, you still got the Thunder. I'm picking the Thunder to win. So I'm not, look, I don't have necessarily a team, because I kind of like the remaining teams. I don't really have a ton of qualms with any of them. Honestly, I don't. I would be perfectly fine with any of the remaining, 5 teams technically to win this year. I expect the Thunder to win, but I would like to see a Thunder, or I would like to see a Timberwolves and Knicks final, because I think that would be just as like a story. It would be really just really compelling, I think. You know what I mean? And it would just put like such a perfect bow on the end of this, just one of the craziest like NBA seasons in memory, right? Just looking back at everything. I think this is really going to stick in my mind as like, of course, with the Warriors winning their championships in prior seasons, of course, those will always like be memorable to me. But I think that this season has been really special. Like, this season has been really something. Not even just, not just from kind of the Warriors perspective, but just across the board, all of just like the craziness that has happened, the trade deadline, obviously the Luka trade, and now where we kind of are in the playoffs, and just how insane this, the playoffs have been, in the second round has been. I think it would just be like it would be a great ending. It would be such a great book ending, if we somehow ended up with that series, to cap it off. But we'll see, we'll see how, once we get there. I'll be happy with like any combination of matchups, in the finals. I like, I think it would just make for, some really interesting matchups and interesting series, like regardless, you know what I mean? Whether it's like Knicks and Thunder, or Pacers Thunder, Knicks, Knicks Wolves, Pacers Wolves, like there's so many different combinations, you know what I mean? If somehow the Nuggets make it, then that, that would kind of make things interesting as well. But man, it's been just like I know I've been kind of, gushing over it, but I just want to highlight that this has been just like a really great season. And I think it's easy to kind of look at it this way in comparison to something like last year, where unfortunately the last, the conference finals were kind of were a bit of a dud. So I'm just happy to see there being like really potentially competitive series going into the final rounds, and just seeing what the just being excited for where it all ends up. All right, I'm gonna record just a quick one here on Sunday. So the second round has come to a close, with the Oklahoma City Thunder beating the Denver Nuggets earlier this afternoon. I only watched like the first half and was kind of score checking for the remainder of it. And yeah, it looked like I didn't really miss too much there in a blowout win by OKC. The last game 7, which was Denver and the Clippers, also ended up in a blowout. So we've struck out on game 7 so far, but I do think that was kind of I expected OKC to win this one. Aaron Gordon was he was diagnosed with a grade 2 what was it, hamstring strain, and he played, and I was like, dude, that's fucking gnarly, man. I hope he doesn't aggravate it even more. Luckily nothing happened. But yeah, that was it was I think it was going to be tough for Denver. The fact that they made it a 7-game series is pretty crazy. The fact that they were able to push this Thunder team to that point is really impressive, right? Obviously it does help to have someone like Jokic on your team to be able to do that. But you still got to credit the surrounding, just the team in general as well. So yeah, I mean, the second round has come to a close. I want to do like a, conference final sort of preview tomorrow, just so that I can, sort through my thoughts and go over some things here and there before kind of delving into it. But we have it's official now that we are going to get a unique champion for the 7th year in a row, right? Starting in 2019, which I think is very, it kind of is signaling this era that we're in, where under just like new CBA rules and all that stuff, and whatever trade and signing limitations there are with second apron rules and all that stuff, there is less of an ability for teams to be able to take on contracts and to form something like a super team, right? I don't know I still am like, I don't really get the full just like the everything that kind of goes into this agreement, but I think it's shown to pretty significantly limit the ability for teams to be really able to make any moves, which is both as a league wide thing, is both like a good and bad thing, right? It's a good thing in the sense that teams that do have, who are considered more of like a trade and location destination, don't have as much leverage as they used to, right? You're not going to get, there is just not this possibility of teams to be able to retain their players depending on the contracts that they signed them to, right? So it feels like we're just not going to get obviously we're still pretty early on to this, but it doesn't feel like there's really a chance for any team to be able to kind of like, I guess like other than OKC at this point, it's pretty difficult to try to envision a team building a sort of a legacy or a, like a dynasty type of championship team, because there was just not that flexibility to be able to do so, right? In the case of like OKC, they've with just how Sam Presti has handled it, it's been just they've done just like an incredible job of building their roster, but also having the assets to be able to make moves if they need to, right? So if they somehow fall short of going to the Western Conference Finals this year, it's like, okay, well, we can run it back, or we can do something with all of the draft assets that they've stockpiled, right? So I think it feels like they're in a pretty good position moving forward, at least for like the pretty near future, for 3-4 years down the line. In the case of just like everybody else, it's just kind of like, yeah, I mean, it could be now, it could be later. Like we really don't know. And it's just like there's always just like a shifting kind of pendulum and a shifting goalposts for what teams are able to achieve with kind of what what they're able to do under the agreement. So again, something that I am so just it's so surface level understanding of, that, but I do think it is pretty clear that it has had a significant impact on teams' ability to build and to trade and all that stuff, right? That being said, I think where we are now, like, you can absolutely argue that this sort of limits and it kind of hamstrings, no, like, not even trying to be like funny, but like it does, really put kind of this put this lid on the teams to be able to really do a whole lot, you know what I mean? And I think that although that is kind of it's maybe harder to manage and to try to maneuver, there's less flexibility, I do think that this kind of puts a lot of pressure on GMs and front offices to make even more calculated decisions on their future, right? Which I think is important in a way. I'm not saying it's like I don't think it's like a good or bad thing necessarily. I think that I do think that there is like a positive in the sense that, GMs aren't so flippantly just like, we'll just get this guy. Like, we'll trade for whoever with, this amount of draft picks. There has to be some really strong decision making that has to be made in order to build a team, right? And sure, that's like maybe it's like more difficult of a task, but I do think that in the end, I think you could get potentially a better product in the process. You might get a better team in the process. So, and then where we're at now, we have such a variety of teams that are in the conference finals now. It's exciting. I think it's really exciting. I think this is probably the most exciting conference finals that we've had in some time. And sure, of course, like that all is like variability in terms of like, it's like, last year just didn't really work out the way, we anticipated it. And that could be the case just, year by year. And we sort of stumbled into a great sort of conference finals, Final Four matchup. But I do think that there is some credence to the fact that we ended up in this position due to, how these sorts of new rules have been executed. And I listen, man, I think it's cool that we're seeing this, and I understand that there may be some ramifications down the line, and I totally understand that. But look, if the game itself, if the teams themselves are exciting and fun to watch, I really have no complaints, and I'm happy to see that there is gonna be a new champion. I think that's really exciting. It feels just very open in the sense. Sure, OKC is clearly kind of heads above all of these other teams that are remaining. But regardless of that, like, you saw the fact that they had issues with a Denver team who was pretty hobbled and not very deep, a very top-heavy team. And despite that, you saw Denver hold up really well against this the Thunder, and they I think they kind of just ran out of gas with Gordon getting injured, and Porter's been injured this whole series, and Jokic is just doing his best to carry this team, and Jamal Murray has had good moments, but even him, it's going to be hard. You know what I mean? When you're so reliant on your top players to kind of push this team forward. So I think you kind of saw what that looked like, where you have a more veteran team pushing this more young and inexperienced team. So we'll see how Minnesota fares against them. I'll get into more of that kind of later, tomorrow, and discuss that. But I do feel, I feel kind of, I'm sticking with what my early preseason sort of prediction was that the Thunder were going to win the championship, and I'm sticking to that for the time being. I mean, I'm sticking to that. Like, that's just, unless they get eliminated, then it's like, all right, then I gotta switch things up. But that's been my prediction this whole year, and we'll see if that comes to fruition. I'm hoping that we'll get some exciting. I'm hoping that the Wolves are able to push the Thunder. But yeah, again, we'll talk about all that stuff and reflect on the teams that got eliminated and those kinds of things if I want to get into that as well. But yeah, just wanted to kind of hop on and talk a little briefly about the result. We're through the second round. We're going to the conference finals. Unfortunately, we're only getting a game a day. No games on tomorrow, so that's where it would be a good timing to talk about that. So I'm gonna save that conversation and wait until I go a little bit more in depth tomorrow regarding the matchups between the Pacers, the Knicks, and the Wolves and the Thunder. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Anyways, got a three-parter. This is a little three-parter this kind of past weekend. So that was fun. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for listening as always. This has been Save the Spantics. Signing off.